Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to discuss a commentary on the books of Judges and Ruth in Kriegel's Exegetical Commentary Library, written by Bob Chisholm. Bob Chisholm is with us today to discuss his commentary.
Hi, Herb. Good to be here. It's always good to see you.
Always good to see you. Always a pleasure. Let's talk a little bit about your commentary on Judges and Ruth. And as you think about this commentary, what would you say the overriding process, thesis is for this commentary and its contribution to the series?
Well, as a commentary writer, you're trying to bring out the message of the book in its original context, but also trying to build a bridge for pastors who are responsible for teaching and preaching the book to their congregations and showing its relevance for our modern age. So the procedure that I used in the commentary was I would talk about backgrounds, but then develop the exegetical idea. So at the end of each section of Judges, let's say the Samson story, at the end there will be a discussion of what the story meant in the context of the book of Judges in its original ancient Israelite context, and I call that the exegetical idea. And I try to boil the message of the passage down to an exegetical idea, but we can't leave it there. And the next step is to kind of decontextualize it a little bit. If we can think of the story as being contextualized in ancient Israel's history and culture, we want to come out of that a little bit and get a theological principle that's more timeless, that reflects the message of the Bible as a whole. How does this story in Judges fit into the theology of the Scriptures as a whole? So we get our theological message, which derives from our exegetical message. Next step is to develop what I call homiletical trajectories. And that's where I take the major themes of the book of Judges, and I think there are 3 in Judges, and try to show how each of those themes is developed theologically and how it could be relevant to a modern audience. So those homiletical trajectories lead toward an applicational idea. So even though this is a pretty thorough commentary, I forget how many pages, I think it's around 700 on Judges and Ruth, I always had the pastor in mind. And so my goal is to show pastors how to develop the message of the book and for a modern audience.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk. You talked a little bit about the focus and making sure you're addressing historical and yet extracting that historical context or message to make it more contemporary. How does the commentary unfold? How do you go about developing and demonstrating it?
Well, there's an introduction that deals with various issues related to the book of Judges: authorship, date, structure, themes, other commentaries. I kind of give a little review of other commentaries. I talk about Hebrew clausal structure, just a variety of things, the kinds of things you would expect in an introduction to a commentary.
Okay.
Some of that might be of more interest than others to pastors. But I think it's all important, and so we have an introduction to the commentary, which is pretty lengthy, I think close to 100 pages. Then I divide the book up into its major sections, like the prologue, 1:1 through 3:6. Then we have the central section of the book, 3:7 through the end of chapter 16, I think it's verse 31. And of course there are various stories in there, some short, like Ehud, some long, like Gideon and Samson. But we work through the central section, and then there's the epilogue, chapters 17 through 21. Well, for each of those major sections, I have a commentary. I translate the passage with notes related to translation, and then we go through verse by verse and talk about what the text meant in its historical context. And then at the end of each of those sections, we go through this process that I outlined earlier. There's a summary of the message with the exegetical idea, followed by the theological message that derives from the exegetical message, and then the homiletical, what I call trajectories, and the applicational idea. So in this way, your application flows right out of the theology of the passage, which is rooted in the exegesis. And so I feel confident that these applicational ideas that I'm suggesting really derive from the text. I'm not importing them from elsewhere in the Bible.
Okay.
And I think it's important for us when we preach to do that, to make sure we have biblical authority.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
What spurred you to write this commentary?
That's a good question, and the process started so long ago, it's kind of hard to remember. I really started working on this in the early 1990s. I'd always enjoyed, as a child, the stories of the Bible, Samson and Gideon, and so I was always drawn to biblical narrative, and I was interested in what is the significance of the book of Judges, and I was getting involved in studying the Bible as literature, as narrative. Leland Ryken and some others were doing work in that area, and I found that fascinating, talking about, setting and plot and that kind of characterization, those kinds of things. And so I got real interested in narrative literature, and a lot of people shy away from the book of Judges because, let's face it, if we were going to do a movie on Judges, it'd probably qualify as X or whatever category they use these days. There's a lot of violence in there, a lot of bad things happening, and so I think a lot of people shy away from it just thinking, oh, this is just a record of how Israel horribly disobeyed God, and I don't even want to read these horrible stories, but they're there for a reason. And so it was a challenge to me to think through, okay, what's the significance of the book of Judges, and how would we teach and preach it in a modern setting? And so I think that's kind of what challenged me early on. And the more I got into it, the more I realized the depth of theology that is there. Just a fascinating book. And of course, it comes right after Joshua, and it does record how Israel fell away after this period of initial success, but it also sets the stage for Samuel. Everybody's interested in the books of Samuel because David is there. But Judges is a very important bridge from Joshua to David. And so I think just an interest in showing how it's relevant for a modern audience. I think that's what spurred me on, but it was a long time ago when I embarked on this pathway.
All right. Well, so, and you may have already said this, but let me just stick to my script here.
Okay.
How might the book be helpful to a pastor? In some ways, I think you've already alluded to this throughout this interview, but maybe more pointedly.
Okay. Well, pastors who are dedicated to teaching from the Bible, doing biblical exposition, I think the commentary will help them understand some difficult passages. In other words, was it right or wrong for Ehud to trick King Eglon and then assassinate him? What do we make of Samson? He does a lot of great things on behalf of the Lord, but then his life kind of ends in tragedy. So I try to help the reader assess characters and bring out a lot of details that maybe some people would not be aware of. As a scholar, I have access to a lot of sources. I have the luxury of studying the book thoroughly. And so I feel like I've brought a lot of details out that will be helpful just from a standpoint of understanding the text. In my own teaching and preaching of Judges, frequently people have come up to me afterward and said, wow, you really made the Bible come alive for me today. I'd heard that story before, but I had never really thought about it quite that way. And that's just the literary approach, which you may be familiar with from English class in high school. You talk about how is this piece of literature put together, how does the characterization work, plot, that kind of thing. I try to bring all of that out, and so I really feel that a pastor will gain a pretty good understanding of what this book means. But then, as I said before, I don't leave it there. We can't just leave it there. Our lessons can't just be history lessons. And so I then try to build that bridge that I spoke about earlier, where we move to the theology of the passage and then talk about how we might apply that theological message in a modern context.
Okay, well, good. Well, one last question as we wrap up this discussion about your commentary on Judges and Ruth. What other sources might be helpful, advantageous for a pastor if he's working through Judges and Ruth? What other sources might be helpful for him in addition to your commentary?
Okay, I like the way you put that, in addition to. I have an extensive bibliography at the end of the commentary on Judges, and then another one on Ruth at the end of the section on Ruth. I also have a discussion in the commentary, in the introduction, where I assess other commentaries on Ruth and talk about their value, their usability for pastors, and I divide them up into two types, more exegetical commentaries and then more expositional commentaries. And so I have all of that laid out and discussed in detail in the commentary, but I found, as I was doing my work, Dan Block's commentary in the New American Commentary series on Judges and Ruth to be helpful. I disagreed with him on some key ideas in Ruth, so I find Judges more helpful than I do Ruth, but still it's good work and deserves to be read and studied. The NIV application commentary is always, I think, valuable. Lawson Younger did the one on Judges, and I believe, he did the one on Ruth as well. Judges and Ruth are always, well, not always, but frequently put together. And so those are two that I found helpful. Also, a scholar by the name of Dale Ralph Davis has written a very nice book on Judges that's especially helpful, I think, for preachers.
Okay.
He's a preacher himself as well as a scholar, and I can't remember the title of that book, but it's mentioned in my commentary, and I found Davis's work to be helpful.
Okay. All right. Well, Bob, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Well, good to chat, Herb.
Likewise, yeah. And thank you for joining us. And for those of you who are contemplating a new series to preach, let me encourage you to pick up Bob Chisholm's book, his commentary on Judges and Ruth, and think about, contemplate, maybe even schedule out and pencil out a preaching schedule and preach your way through the book of Ruth. Until next time, I hope you have a great day. Thank you.